They laughed when they saw her standing alone, eyes red, hands trembling on the cold stone. A group of teenagers whispered. One even raised his phone to record the scene. They didn't know, and never cared to ask, why an elderly woman cried quietly at the war memorial under the summer sun. Her name was Eleanor Hart. She was 84 years old, and every morning, just as the sun began to rise, she followed the same quiet routine. She would boil a small pot of tea, pin her thin silver hair into a neat bun, and take out the bouquet she had prepared the night before, always white chrysanthemums. Then she'd lace up the same pair of worn, soft-soled shoes she'd worn for years and walk, slowly but steadily, toward the war memorial downtown. It was a stone wall, cold and solemn, etched with the names of hundreds of fallen soldiers. Most people passed it without a glance. But Eleanor came every day, rain or shine, in winter's chill or summer's heat. She never missed. And yet, hardly anyone knew her name. No one asked. She was just the old woman by the wall, to most. Quiet, fragile-looking, but with a kind of strength you only notice if you watch long enough. On that particular morning, a group of teenagers wandered through the park, loud and careless, laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Eleanor didn't notice them at first. Her world had narrowed, as it always did, to the path beneath her feet and the name she carried in her heart. She reached the wall, the granite darkened slightly by morning dew. With slow, practiced movements, she knelt down. It took effort now. Her knees ached, her back tensed, but she did it anyway, because this part mattered. Gently, she laid the flowers at the base of the wall, directly beneath one specific name in row 27. Then, with fingers lined by time and memory, she reached up and traced the letters. Her eyes weren't what they used to be, clouded now with age and loss, but she didn't need to see clearly. Her hands remembered. They moved with care, following every groove, every corner of the name carved into the stone. Thomas J. Hart. She whispered it under her breath, like a prayer, a name that once belonged to a man with strong shoulders and a soft voice, a man who left for war with a promise he couldn't keep, and yet somehow still did. Eleanor sat there for a long time, the world moving around her. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't need to. Her silence told a story, one of love, of waiting, of memories held tight across decades. She wasn't there for attention. She wasn't mourning for show. She was visiting someone the world had forgotten, but she never could. And as the teenagers drew closer, snickering behind their phones, they had no idea whose name she was touching, or how much it cost her to be there. Still, the park that morning was quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Eleanor remained where she was, kneeling in front of the monument, her hand resting lightly on the cold stone. She didn't move, didn't speak. The weight of memory pressed gently against her back. Behind her, life went on, but her world, in that moment, was paused in a place where love and loss still lived side by side. A group of teenagers wandered in from the sidewalk, their sneakers slapping carelessly against the pavement. There were 4 of them, all energy and laughter, oblivious of the hush that surrounded the stone wall. One boy nudged the other and pointed. "Hey, she's crying again," he snickered, not bothering to lower his voice. The others turned to look. One girl smirked. Another boy tilted his head, squinting at Eleanor like she was some curiosity behind glass. "Probably live streaming for donations," someone muttered with a dry chuckle. "You know how old people are." They didn't lower their voices. They didn't stop to wonder. In their minds, they weren't doing anything wrong, just making jokes, just passing time. The pain of war, the gravity of loss, the meaning behind a single name etched in granite. Those were things too far removed from their world of notifications and filtered pictures. They saw a hunched figure, alone and fragile, and assumed weakness. They saw tears and assumed drama. None of them had ever held a folded flag, or watched someone leave in uniform and not return. They hadn't felt the kind of silence that lingers for decades, long after taps have played and flowers have withered. One of the boys pulled out his phone. He adjusted the angle, zoomed in slightly, and grinned. "This'll get views," he said. "Old lady crying at a rock. People eat this stuff up." He steadied the phone, preparing to record, his thumb hovering over the red circle. But then, something shifted behind them. There was a presence. Tall, still, commanding. They didn't notice it at first. Just a shadow stretching long over the pavement. A man in uniform had stepped onto the path. His stride was deliberate, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. He wore the crisp blues of a decorated officer, his jacket bearing rows of service ribbons and a single silver star that caught the morning light. He stopped a few feet behind the teens. Didn't speak, just watched. The boy with the phone glanced over his shoulder, casually at first, then froze. The others turned one by one and the smirks faded. There was something in the man's eyes, not anger, not scolding, but something deeper, a kind of sorrow that had hardened into quiet authority. It didn't need volume to be felt. It simply existed, heavy and undeniable. The air changed. Even the birds seemed quieter. Eleanor hadn't noticed any of it. Her fingers still traced a name. Her lips moved in whispers only she and the wind could hear. And now, the teenagers, so full of laughter moments ago, stood motionless. The phone slowly lowered. The boy's hand trembled just enough to be noticed. None of them had expected to be seen, but they were. And the man behind them, he knew exactly whose name she was touching. The man stood tall. His uniform was pressed crisp, the deep navy blue of a high-ranking Army officer. His shoes gleamed beneath him, polished to a mirror shine. A silver star rested above his heart, surrounded by rows of ribbons that told stories most people would never hear, stories of combat survival and sacrifice. But it wasn't the medals that drew attention. It was the weight in his eyes, the way he looked at the stone wall, the way he walked, not like someone arriving, but like someone returning to something sacred. General Allen Briggs had just flown in from Washington that morning. He had served 37 years in the United States Army, stationed in more than a dozen countries, leading men through battles that history would footnote but never fully understand. That morning, he was scheduled to speak at a commemorative ceremony across town, but something had pulled him here first. He had taken a longer route, a quiet detour, like an old habit leading him back to a place where silence spoke louder than applause ever could. When he entered the park, his stride was sure, but his expression was unreadable until he saw her. Eleanor. He recognized her even before he saw the name. The old woman was kneeling at the memorial, her body hunched not just from age, but from memory, from years of coming back to the same place, the same name. Her hand rested on the stone, like she was still holding someone's hand, someone who never made it back. Briggs stopped. His chest rose and fell once. Then he slowly removed his hat. He didn't speak. Not at first. Behind him, the group of teenagers shifted awkwardly. Their laughter had vanished. The boy who'd held up his phone now tucked it behind his back like a child hiding a broken toy. They didn't understand who he was. Not yet, but they could feel it. Something in the way the air had changed. Something in the way the man stood. General Briggs stepped forward. Not toward them, toward her. He walked slowly, each step purposeful. His boots made almost no sound on the paved path. He didn't look at the kids. Not yet. His focus was on the woman in front of him, and the name she touched. When he reached the wall, he lowered his head, closed his eyes. For a moment, the years fell away. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a man decorated by presidents or saluted by troops. He was 21 again, lost, terrified, in the jungle, and there was a man beside him, steady, calm, shouting orders that saved them all. Briggs opened his eyes. His throat tightened. He reached out and placed his hand on the wall, right over the name, Thomas J. Hart. His palm pressed against the cold granite. But what he felt wasn't stone. It was memory, heat, noise, the sound of mortar fire, the smell of blood and sweat and smoke, the look in Hart's eyes when he turned back, just for a second, to tell Briggs to run. Hart hadn't made it out, but his men had. General Briggs didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was quiet, almost reverent. "She comes here every year," he said, not turning around. "Always at this hour. Always on this day." The kids froze. Briggs turned to face them. His gaze was steady. Not cruel, not angry, just full of something heavy, like he had carried it a long time. "Do you even know who she is?" he asked gently. They didn't answer. One boy shook his head slightly, eyes down. Briggs continued, voice measured, each word chosen like he was placing it on sacred ground. "She's the wife of Captain Thomas Hart, the man who saved my entire platoon at Key Sand in 1968. He stayed behind to cover our retreat. He radioed artillery coordinates through gunfire, got shot twice, never stopped talking, because if he had, we would have died in that jungle. All of us." He paused. "If it weren't for him," he said, "I wouldn't be standing here today." The kids were silent. The boy with the phone lowered his arm completely now. His hand shook slightly. The girl beside him bit her lip. No one looked at Eleanor. They couldn't. Not yet. Briggs stepped back and looked down at her. She hadn't moved. Not even flinched. Maybe she hadn't even heard. Or maybe she already knew. Her hand was still on the stone. Her body still folded forward like in prayer. Her lips moved slightly, soundlessly. Briggs knelt beside her. Slowly, knees stiff from years and wounds that never fully healed. He took off his gloves and laid a second bouquet next to hers. This one was roses, red, fresh. He whispered something only she could hear. She nodded, just once. He stood again, this time facing the kids. His voice dropped to something deeper. Not a command, not a lecture, just truth. "I know you're young," he said. "I know this wall means nothing to you. Just names and stone. But those names are lives. Every one of them. Husbands, fathers, sons. Some were younger than you when they died. Some left wives who never stopped waiting." He let the words hang. "No one cries here for attention," he said. "They cry because something sacred is buried beneath the silence. And sometimes that silence deserves more respect than a viral video." He looked at each one of them in turn, not with judgment, but with hope that maybe, just maybe, something would land. Then he nodded, tucked his cap under his arm, and turned back toward the stone. The kids didn't speak, didn't move. Briggs knelt one last time and ran his fingers over the name. His lips trembled. "Thank you, Tommy," he whispered. "You kept us alive. You kept your word." Behind him, one of the boys slowly stepped forward. He didn't say anything, just reached up and touched the name. Not for long, just long enough to feel that cold granite and understand, maybe for the first time, that names can carry weight, that grief isn't weakness, that some love stories don't end in weddings, but in waiting. Eleanor finally stood. It took her a moment, but Briggs offered his arm, and she accepted. Together, they stepped back from the wall. The teenagers parted for them without a word, and the boy with the phone, he opened his photo app and quietly deleted the video. They met in the spring of 1962. Eleanor was working long shifts as a volunteer nurse at the local VA hospital just outside Charleston. Thomas was a Navy man, tall, quiet, with that calm steadiness some men are just born with. He walked with a purpose and spoke like every word mattered. Eleanor noticed that first. Then his hands. Big, callous, careful. The kind of hands that held people together during hard times. They fell in love fast, like many young couples in that era, but their love was different. Not flashy, not loud, just solid, built on early morning walks, handwritten letters, and silent glances that said everything words couldn't. They were married before Christmas that same year. But time wasn't kind to them. Deployment orders came quickly. Vietnam was calling. Thomas left in '64. Eleanor still remembered the exact moment he turned from the train platform to wave, the way he smiled so gently, like he already knew. He promised he'd come home, promised he'd write. And he did, letter after letter, filled with hope and little drawings of the house he wanted to build, of their future. In one of his last letters, he wrote, "I keep thinking about that kitchen window, the one you love. I'll come home and build it just the way you imagined." But the window was never built. Thomas was killed during an intense firefight in the Quang Tri province in late 1965. He had stayed behind to cover his men's retreat, radioed for air support until the very last second. His body wasn't recovered for weeks. When the folded flag arrived at Eleanor's doorstep, she was 6 months pregnant with their first child. She never remarried. Some said she was young. That life could go on. But Eleanor didn't want another love. She had already found hers. The rest of her years were spent raising their son, alone but never bitter. She worked double shifts, skipped vacations, missed holidays. And still, every single year on the anniversary of Thomas's death, she returned to that stone wall. Same time, same place, same bouquet of white chrysanthemums. He kept his promise, she once whispered to a reporter who'd asked why she still came. He said he'd protect his men. And he did, even when it meant he wouldn't come back to me. That's the kind of love that doesn't fade. The kind that leaves a shadow long after the sun sets. And that's the name she touched, year after year. Not just a name carved in stone, but a life, a promise, a home that never got built, a hand she still reached for in her sleep. No one laughed anymore. The air felt heavier now, like the moment was stretching longer than it should. The teenagers stood frozen, their laughter swallowed by the weight of something they couldn't quite grasp. The boy who had held his phone up lowered it slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he powered it off. The other kids shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, unsure what to do or say. And then, one by one, they moved back. But there was one who lingered, stepping closer. His eyes were downcast, his face now pale. He hesitated for a moment before he took off his cap, a gesture that felt somehow older than his years. He walked toward Eleanor with slow, deliberate steps, as if the ground beneath him was heavier than it had been moments before. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He simply lowered his head, a silent apology wrapped in the gravity of his actions. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wall in front of her, where the name Thomas J. Hart still glistened in the early light. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, a gesture that carried decades of pain, love, and memory in a single motion. She didn't turn to him. She didn't need to. She only turned back to the wall. Her hands gently traced the name once more, and then softly, she began to whisper again, the same words she had likely whispered for the past 50 years, words only Thomas could hear. And in that moment, the world fell away. For Eleanor, for Thomas, and for the boy who now understood, not everything is what it seems, and some tears are born of something far greater than we can imagine. The next morning, the stone was no longer alone. Just beneath Thomas Hart's name, someone had quietly placed a bronze plaque. It was small, polished, and fastened with care. The words engraved on it were few, but they held the weight of a lifetime. Husband, father, hero, a man who lived for others. There was no announcement, no music, just the early light of morning catching the shine of metal, and the quiet footsteps of the first visitor who stopped to read it. From that year forward, something changed. The anniversary of Thomas's death was no longer marked by just one pair of hands placing flowers. People began to come, veterans, widows, nurses, grandchildren who had only heard stories. They brought small bouquets. Some left notes. Others simply bowed their heads, whispering his name like a prayer. The old woman who used to cry alone was no longer alone. No one laughed anymore. They understood now that her tears had never been for show. They were a devotion the world had overlooked, a kind of remembrance deeper than words. Some grief, after all, is sacred. And maybe, just maybe, every older face we pass holds a story like hers, a name they whisper when no one is listening. So if you've ever known someone like Eleanor, don't forget them. Don't walk past them. And if stories like this stay with you, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel, not for views, not for trends, but to remember, because we tell these stories, so no one is ever forgotten